Republicans and Democrats disagree on almost everything, or at least that is what they want you to believe. Turn on the television, scroll social media, watch a press conference, and the message is always the same. The other side is the real threat. The other side is destroying the country. The other side is corrupt, dangerous, extreme. And sometimes those accusations are even true. But here's the inconvenient part. For all their public warfare, both parties often protect the same deeper system, the same money pipelines, the same influence networks, the same bureaucratic insulation, the same revolving doors, the same machine that keeps power concentrated, accountability diluted, and ordinary citizens on the outside looking in. They fight over who gets to control the system. They fight far less over whether the system itself should exist in its current form. That is why the scandals keep coming. That is why the incentives never seem to change. That is why trust keeps collapsing. Because beneath all the partisan noise, the public record points to something far more unsettling. Not a country divided between good guys and bad guys, but a political class, on both sides of the aisle, that has learned how to survive inside the same corrupt architecture of power. And the public pays for it. If all of this sounds cynical, consider the mood of the country. Americans do not agree on much anymore. Not on culture, not on economics, not on the role of government, not even on what kind of country they think America should be. But there is one thing millions of people across the political spectrum seem to understand instinctively. The system does not feel like it belongs to them. Most Americans believe money has far too much influence in politics. They believe wealthy donors, lobbyists, and special interests have a louder voice than ordinary citizens. And they believe the average person, the taxpayer, the worker, the small business owner, the parent trying to keep up with bills, has far too little influence over the decisions that shape their lives. That is not a fringe belief. That is not a partisan talking point. That is the mainstream view of the American public. And maybe that should tell us something. When people on the left, the right, and in the exhausted middle all start arriving at the same basic conclusion, that the political class is serving itself before it serves the country, we should probably stop dismissing that instinct as paranoia, because people can feel when a system is no longer truly responsive. They can feel when the language of representation is still there, but the reality underneath it has changed. They can feel when politics becomes performance, when outrage becomes marketing, when reform becomes a slogan, when accountability becomes selective, when elections change the cast, but somehow the incentives stay the same. And that is where this story really starts. Not with one scandal, not with one party, not with one corrupt politician caught in one embarrassing moment, but with a deeper public realization that something structural has gone wrong, that power is circulating inside a closed ecosystem, and that the people outside that ecosystem are expected to clap, vote, pay, and move along. That is the mood. That is the backdrop. And that is why this conversation is important. Now, to be clear, this does not mean both parties are identical. They are not. They differ on real issues. They differ on culture, on rhetoric, on priorities, on policy, and on the constituencies they openly serve. Elections have real consequences. Personnel make a difference. Laws have impact, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But that is not the point. The point is that beneath all of those real differences, both parties operate inside the same incentive structure. They both need money. They both need donors. They both need media oxygen. They both need institutional protection. They both need access to the same power centers in Washington. And they both learn very quickly what kinds of behavior are rewarded inside that world and what kinds are punished. What gets rewarded is not principle, not usually. What gets rewarded is message discipline, fundraising, network building, narrative control, strategic outrage, selective silence, and the ability to serve the machine without ever quite admitting that the machine exists. That is why politicians who campaign as outsiders so often govern like insiders. That is why anti-establishment rhetoric so often melts into procedural excuses, donor-friendly compromises, and carefully managed disappointment. That is why the slogans change more often than the incentives do. The conflict is real, but the operating system is shared. Republicans and Democrats are not the same tribe, but they are often playing the same game, inside the same arena, with the same donor class hovering overhead, the same bureaucratic maze underneath them, and the same public expected to believe that this endless theater is genuine accountability. And once you see that, a lot of modern politics starts making much more sense. You stop asking why corruption is never fully uprooted. You stop asking why reform is always promised and rarely delivered. You stop asking why so many political careers seem to end exactly where they began, with more money, more influence, more connections, and the public that is somehow still being told to wait just a little longer. That is the deeper pattern, and it is the pattern that matters. So what does that machinery actually look like in practice? It starts with money. Not always in the cartoon form people imagine. Not always a briefcase full of cash slid across a table in a smoke-filled back room. Modern corruption is usually quieter than that. Cleaner, more procedural, more respectable. It looks like donor access. It looks like the people who fund campaigns, bankroll PACs, hire lobbyists, host private dinners, and keep the machinery of modern politics running, getting a louder voice than the people who merely vote. It looks like elected officials spending enormous amounts of time raising money, building relationships with donors, and protecting the networks that make their careers possible. It looks like access becoming influence, and influence becoming policy. And then there are the lobbyists. Not because every lobbyist is a villain, but because lobbying is one of the clearest ways power translates itself into results. The industries with the most money, the deepest Rolodexes, the best lawyers, the best connected consultants, and the longest relationships with Washington do not have to win every fight. They just have to stay in the room. They just have to shape the language, slow the reform, add the carve-out, protect the subsidy, preserve the loophole, delay the accountability, and make sure that when the final bill emerges, it still works well enough for the people who mattered most. Then there's the revolving door. Staffers become lobbyists, regulators become consultants, lawmakers become influence brokers, and people who once claimed to serve the public discover that the most profitable version of public service often begins the moment they leave office. That does not require a secret conspiracy. It only requires a system in which everyone understands where the rewards are, and above all, it looks like insulation. Layers of committees, agencies, procedures, staff, advisors, spokespeople, technical language, jurisdictional fog. Enough complexity that blame can always be blurred, delayed, redirected, or buried. That is what modern corruption often looks like. Not always dramatic, not always illegal, not always obvious in isolation. Just 1,000 small mechanisms, all bending power toward the connected, and all making it harder for ordinary citizens to know who made the decision, who benefited from it, and who should actually be held responsible. That is the machine. And once you see how it works, it becomes much easier to understand why both parties, despite all the theater, are so reluctant to dismantle it. And that brings us to the question people keep asking. If everybody knows this is broken, why is it never truly reformed? The answer is not that nobody sees the problem. The answer is that too many of the people with the power to fix it are adapted to it. The system does not survive because it is invisible. It survives because it is useful. Useful to politicians who campaign against corruption while quietly benefiting from donor networks, media exposure, and institutional protection. Useful to lobbyists, consultants, and influence brokers whose entire business model depends on complexity, access, and managed outcomes. Useful to bureaucracies that accumulate authority, diffuse accountability, and treat transparency like a threat to be managed rather than a duty to be honored. Useful to media organizations that thrive on partisan spectacle, emotional outrage, and the endless production of conflict, while the deeper machinery of power gets far less attention. And useful to a political class that has learned a very important lesson. You do not actually have to solve the problem. You only have to perform concern about it often enough to survive the next election cycle. That is why reform is always just over the horizon. why hearings are held, why speeches are given, why task forces are assembled, why outrage is expressed, why promises are made. And then somehow the structure remains. The money still flows, the access still matters, the bureaucracy still expands, the accountability still blurs. And the public is told once again that real change is coming, just not yet. Because real reform is dangerous to the people who have learned how to rise inside the existing order. Real reform threatens careers. It threatens donor relationships. It threatens access. It threatens future board seats, consulting deals, media relevance, institutional prestige, and the quiet arrangements that make Washington function for the people already inside it. That is why so much political energy gets redirected into symbolic battles, moral theater, and carefully packaged outrage. Those things are safer. They make people feel like something is happening. They energize voters. They raise money. They feed headlines. They punish the other tribe. But they do not require dismantling the architecture that keeps the whole game running. And that is why the system is so resilient. Not because it is good, not because it is trusted, but because it is deeply useful to the people most empowered to preserve it. And that is the real public record. Not that one party is pure and the other is rotten. Not that every politician is corrupt in the same way or to the same degree. And not that elections, laws, or leadership choices do not matter. They do. But beneath all of that, the deeper pattern is hard to ignore. A system built to absorb outrage without surrendering power. A system built to convert public anger into headlines, donations, hearings, slogans, and campaigns, while protecting the machinery that keeps the connected insulated and the public at a distance. That is why the scandals never seem to end, why trust never seems to recover, why reform is always promised and somehow always postponed. Because the core problem is not just bad people. It is a structure that rewards the appearance of accountability more often than the reality of it. And if the public keeps confusing performance with reform, outrage with justice, and partisan victory with actual change, then the machine does not need to defeat us. It only needs to keep us distracted. That is the inconvenient public record. And the longer we refuse to read it clearly, the longer the same people, the same institutions, and the same incentives will keep writing the story for us. This is the inconvenient public record. Read the record, ignore the theater. If you found value in this, subscribe to the Inconvenient Public Record. More videos on corruption, power, politics, economics, and the stories the public record actually tells are on the way. And if you want to keep going, watch the next video now.